Prologue, The Sky Over Willow Hollow. Prologue, The Sky Over Willow Hollow. There is a place, you will not find it on any map, though you may have visited it in a half-remembered dream, called Willow Hollow. It is a small neighborhood built in the crook of a slow green creek, with one long park at its heart, a scatter of porches and picnic tables, a community garden gone a little wild at the edges, and a very old oak tree that everyone, without ever quite deciding to, called the grandfather oak. If you stood at the top of Prosperous Hill on a clear night, you could see the whole hollow spread out below you, the amber squares of kitchen windows, the blue flicker of porch lights, the black ribbon of the creek catching the moon. And if you looked up instead of down, you would see something else, 4 stars, closer together than stars usually stand, low over the rooftops, so steady and so calm that the old folks of the hollow had a name for them, the 4 Watchers. Nobody remembered exactly when the naming started. Grandpa Lee said his own grandmother had pointed them out to him from this very hill, and told him that as long as the 4 Watchers hung low over Willow Hollow, no true harm would ever come to a child sleeping there. It was the kind of thing grown-ups say to make bedtime feel safer, and also, as it turned out, the kind of thing that happened to be entirely true. This is the story of one year in Willow Hollow, the year a girl named Nellie Bly tied a string to a dragonfly's wing without asking, the year a kitten and an owl set off in a wagon to find a wedding ring, the year the whole neighborhood learned, bit by bit, porch by porch, garden row by garden row, what it actually takes to make a star listen. It begins, as these things sometimes do, with a very small mistake. Chapter 1, The Thread That Wouldn't Hold. Chapter 1, The Thread That Wouldn't Hold. Nellie Bly was 7 years old and had never in her life caught anything faster than a moth, so when the dragonfly landed on the porch rail beside her, wings like 2 scraps of stained glass, body the blue-green of a new penny left out in the rain, she moved before she thought, the way children do, and closed both hands around it before it even knew to be afraid. "Got you," she whispered. The dragonfly was, in fact, not an ordinary dragonfly, though Nellie had no way of knowing that yet. Her name, she did have one, though nobody in Willow Hollow had ever asked, was Tizzy, and she had been sent down from someplace considerably higher than the porch rail to see whether this particular neighborhood, in this particular year, still had any wonder left in it. It was, in a sense, her job to be caught. It was not, however, her plan to stay caught. Nellie found a length of kite string in the kitchen drawer and, with the careful, unthinking cruelty that comes from loving something too hard and too suddenly, tied one end around the dragonfly's middle, just behind the wings, and the other end around her own finger. "There," she said. "Now you can fly and I can keep you. Both at once. I'm very clever." She named her Tizzy Muzzy, because it was the silliest, loveliest name she could think of, and for 3 days that summer, Tizzy Muzzy the dragonfly lived on the end of Nellie Bly's string. She flew loops around the porch light. She rested on the mantelpiece over the fireplace, wings folded like a closed book, and let Nellie stroke one wing with a single careful finger. She dove low over the lavender bushes and came back smelling of purple. Nellie began to think of the mantelpiece as Tizzy Muzzy's castle, and would carry her there each evening, murmuring to her the way you might murmur to a doll, or a very small and very patient queen. But dragonflies, even ones on secret errands from somewhere higher than porch rails, were built for open sky, not string, and on the 3rd night, with a thread of moonlight sliding in through the window and pooling silver on the mantel, Tizzy Muzzy gave one hard, determined tug, and the string, worn thin by 3 days of small escapes and gentler returns, gave way. She did not fly far, at first. She hovered by the window, wings blurring, and looked back at the small sleeping shape of Nellie Bly curled on the rug where she'd fallen asleep waiting for one more visit to the mantelpiece castle. Something in Tizzy Muzzy, something old and a little bit magic, softened. She was not angry. She understood, in the strange, patient way that creatures sent on errands from somewhere higher up tend to understand things, that Nellie hadn't meant unkindness. She had meant the opposite of unkindness, and simply hadn't yet learned that love sometimes needs its hands open instead of closed. "Fly, little star," Tizzy Muzzy thought, in a voice that was not quite a voice, aimed at the sleeping girl. "Your world is more than my castle. And I have a whole hollow to visit before I can tell anyone whether it deserves what's coming." She slipped out through the gap in the window screen, and Willow Hollow, all unknowing, had just let its testing time begin. Above the rooftops, so faint that no one but a dragonfly on an errand would have noticed, the four watchers brightened, very slightly, the way a person's eyes brighten when a story they have been waiting a long time to hear finally begins. Chapter 2, The Owl and the Kitten's Night Adventure. Chapter 2, The Owl and the Kitten's Night Adventure. Half a mile from Nellie Bly's porch, in the crook of the grandfather oak, Ozzy the owl was not asleep, which was unusual, because owls generally are not awake to see sunsets, only to see the dark that follows them. But Ozzy had a guest. Clementine Clem, to everyone who loved her, which by that point in her short life was most of Willow Hollow, was a small tabby kitten who had wandered into the hollow as a stray 2 winters back and been quietly, thoroughly adopted by a young woman named Mary, whose garden sat 2 streets over and 1 turn past the library. Clem had grown up half in Mary's kitchen and half in the branches of the grandfather oak, because Ozzy the owl had taken a liking to her from her very first wobbling, big-pawed spring, and had more or less appointed himself her uncle, her tutor, and, on nights like this one, her partner in mild, well-organized mischief. There is, Ozzy said that evening, settling his feathers with the particular satisfaction of an owl about to announce a plan, a wedding happening in the birch glade by the creek tomorrow at dusk. The fox is officiating. I have it on excellent authority, mine, that no one has thought to arrange a ring. Clem, who was young enough to still find every single fact about the world astonishing, sat up very straight. Whose wedding? The bees, I believe. Or possibly the fireflies. It matters rather less than the ring situation, which is dire. Ozzy tilted his round face. Shall we help? Of course they would help. By the time the moon was a fat coin over the treetops, Clem and Ozzy had loaded an old wooden wagon one Mary had left tipped over by the shed, half forgotten, with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a compass Ozzy kept for occasions exactly like this one, a hand-drawn map on a scrap of parchment that was really just a torn grocery bag, and a small tin harmonica that Ozzy played, very badly and very happily, the entire way. Oh bright Clem, he hummed between verses, your eyes twinkle so brightly. You are such a clever cat. You are. I am sure it is the finest wagon ride in all this world. You always say that, Clem said, though she was smiling, because it was true every time. They found fireflies dancing low over the meadow grass, and a plump pig snuffling contentedly at the roots of a clover patch, and in the clover, bright as a dropped coin, a ring. Not a jewel, exactly. A perfect, smooth-worn circle of green glass, the kind the creek sometimes tumbled loose from wherever old bottles go to be forgiven. Dear pig, Clem asked, with the enormous politeness of a kitten who has been taught always to ask, would you trade it? The pig considered this with the gravity pigs bring to all decisions. I'll swap it for a dance, she said finally, and so a dance was had, right there in the clover, kitten and pig and firefly light, until the wise old fox, Willow Hollow's oldest and most dignified resident, gray at the muzzle and gracious in all things, came trotting up the path with his officiant's collar, a strip of red ribbon, worn proudly, already knotted at his throat. I'll officiate, the fox announced, settling beneath the tallest spruce as though he'd been rehearsing the line all week, which, in fact, he had. The wedding itself, 2 fireflies, if you must know, who had been circling each other since the previous summer and had finally worked up the nerve, was small and lovely and lasted exactly as long as it takes honey cakes to be properly enjoyed and berry tea to go from steaming to just right. The nightingale sang. Everyone danced, even the fox, even Ozzy, whose owl dancing consisted mostly of turning his head all the way around, which the fireflies found delightful. It was well past midnight when Clem finally curled up in the wagon bed, half asleep, watching the fireflies blink out one by one over the meadow like a story finishing itself. Ozzy, she murmured, was that magic? Finding the ring, and the pig, and everything working out? Ozzy considered this the way he considered everything, slowly, and with his whole round face. I think, he said at last, it was mostly kindness, arranged very conveniently. But I won't tell if you'd rather call it magic. Neither of them noticed the dragonfly who had drifted along above the wagon for the last half-mile of the journey home, wings catching moonlight, watching the whole small, generous evening with an interest that was, in its way, a kind of grating. One, Tizzy-Muzzy thought. One small kindness, freely arranged. Let's see what else this hollow has in it. Chapter 3, Under the Willow's Whisper. Chapter 3, Under the Willow's Whisper. Morning in Willow Hollow belonged, unofficially, to Squeaky, a gray squirrel of enormous energy and negligible patience, who considered it his personal duty to be the first thing anyone met on any given day, whether they wanted to meet a squirrel or not. He met Clem at the base of the grandfather oak, still yawning from the wetting, and immediately began narrating his morning at top speed. "There's a raccoon in a leaf hat down by the mossy eaves, and I mean an actual leaf hat. He wore it, on purpose, and the ducks are doing their side-by-side thing in the creek again, and the frogs are humming, and the jay in the berry cart is being extremely rude about it, and also I found a path I've never found before. Want to see it?" Clem, who had learned that the correct response to Squeaky was always yes, said yes. The path wound beneath low branches that dipped and bent to brush the top of Clem's head, past a rabbit who watched them with bright, unbothered curiosity, past the raccoon, leaf hat confirmed, and worn, the raccoon explained with dignity, for the shade, not the fashion, though also the fashion, and out along the edge of the pond, where dragonflies, many dragonflies, though Clem didn't yet know to look for one in particular, skimmed the still water in bright, darting arcs. "Follow closely," the wind seemed to say, or maybe it was only the reeds, or maybe, and this was closer to true, it was Tizzy Muzzy herself, who had taken to drifting near Clem since the wedding, curious about the small kitten who asked whether kindness counted as magic. "There's so much to see." The path led them, eventually, past mushrooms clustered like a fairy's front step and a stand of bamboo that clattered gently in the breeze, to a place where the trail simply widened out into meadow, sun-warmed and humming with bees. Squeaky flung his paws wide. "See? No magic needed. The world's just a book that's already open. You only have to walk into it." Clem sat back on her haunches and looked around, really looked, the way Ozzy had taught her to look at things, slowly, letting each detail arrive one at a time instead of all at once. The dragonflies. The rabbit's careful hop. The raccoon's ridiculous, wonderful hat. Squeaky, vibrating with the sheer joy of having somewhere new to show someone. "I think," she said slowly, "the world is a little bit of a book. And I think today's page has us in it." Squeaky, who did not often sit still long enough to be moved by anything, sat still, briefly, and was moved by that. Above them, unseen, Tizzy Muzzy noted it down in whatever ledger dragonflies on errands keep, a kitten who notices. A squirrel who shares his mornings freely. This hollow is not nothing. Chapter 4, Mary's Garden of Small Wonders. Chapter 4, Mary's Garden of Small Wonders. If Willow Hollow had a heart, an actual, physical, you could walk to it heart, most residents would have pointed you to Mary's garden. It wasn't large. It took up the strip of yard behind the little blue house where Mary lived with Clem and an ever-shifting population of vegetables in various states of ambition. But it was, by unanimous and unspoken agreement, the most cheerful quarter-acre in the neighborhood. Wind chimes that hummed low and even the smallest breeze, rows of daisies that bowed like they were greeting you personally, a trellis of peas that Mary's neighbor's dog had adopted as his personal shade structure. Mary herself was 24, round-faced and sun-freckled, with the particular calm of someone who has decided, on purpose, to spend her life paying close attention to small things. She had a travel sheet had since she was Clem's age and cat years, a watering can with a dent shaped like a story she loved to tell, and a habit of talking to her plants in the same easy, unhurried voice she used for everyone and everything, which was, Clem had always thought, the real reason things grew so well for her. On the morning after the wedding, Mary knelt in the garden's back row, pressing something into the soil, not a vegetable seed, Clem noticed, padding up beside her, but something else. Something small and dark and faintly, impossibly warm to the touch, like it had just come in from somewhere sunnier than the hollow's ordinary sky. "What's that one?" Clem asked. Mary smiled without looking up. "A traveler gave it to me. Weeks ago, before you'd even woken up that morning, I found it on the porch rail, of all places, wrapped in a bit of spider silk, if you can believe that. No note. Just the seed." She patted the soil smooth. "Some gifts don't come with instructions. You just plant them, and pay attention, and see what they turn out to want to be." A sparrow landed nearby, hopping close to peck at crumbs Mary had scattered without being asked, and Mary greeted it by name, Pip, apparently, though Clem was fairly sure sparrows didn't usually have names, except that in Willow Hollow, it seemed, everything eventually did. The garden's best magic, Mary said, straightening up and brushing dirt from her knees, isn't the seed. It's this part, the part where you don't get to see the flower yet. You just trust the dirt and the rain in your own two hands, and you keep showing up. She looked down at Clem, who was watching the newly patted down row with the intensity of a kitten who half expected something to sprout on the spot. That's true of gardens. It's true of most things worth having, honestly. Neither of them could have known, though Mary, perhaps, half suspected, the way gardeners sometimes half suspect things, that the seed she'd planted was the first of what Willow Hollow would come to call, once the whole story was finally told, the four wonders, one for each season, one for each watcher in the sky, each one grown not by magic exactly, but by the accumulated, unglamorous, everyday work of a neighborhood being kind to itself. The spring seed had just gone into the ground. Spring's wonder had begun. Chapter 5, Handy Dandy Jack's Sweet Sprint and the Hill Above the Hollow. Chapter 5, Handy Dandy Jack's Sweet Sprint and the Hill Above the Hollow. Handy Dandy Jack was, by his own cheerful admission, the sweetest toothed boy in Willow Hollow, which was a title he'd earned honestly across 9 years of trading, saving, and occasionally outright begging for anything involving sugar. He skipped to town most mornings with his pockets turned inside out empty on purpose, he always explained, so there's room for whatever I find, and came home most afternoons with them bulging, a paper twist of gumdrops, a jar of jam traded fair and square, once, memorably, an entire lemon someone at the grocer's had simply handed him because his grin was that good. That week, though, Jack's sweet sprint took a different shape. He'd noticed, the way sharp-eyed 9-year-olds notice things adults have trained themselves not to see, that Mrs. Alvarez 2 doors down hadn't been out to her mailbox in 3 days, and that old Mr. Petrakis's grocery bags looked heavier than his arms these days. So Handy Dandy Jack, without telling anyone, without expecting a single gumdrop in return, started running small errands alongside his sweet ones. A jar of jam handed not to himself but through Mrs. Alvarez's screen door, with as the grocer had extra, "Don't worry about it," that wasn't entirely true but was entirely kind. A bag carried the last block for Mr. Petrakis, whose thank you Jack waved off with the particular embarrassed pride of a boy not used to being thanked for things. "Thank you, sir," he'd say, when it was the other way round, beaming and clapping, but more and more that week, it was Jack doing the thanking back, and Jack didn't mind that switch one bit. Up on Prosperous Hill, where the community garden's outer plots gave way to an actual working vegetable field tended by a cooperative of families, Jack ran into a different kind of lesson entirely. A farmhand, a man everyone simply called Big Tomas, broad-shouldered and slow-spoken, who'd worked that hill for longer than Jack had been alive, was leaning on his hoe at the top of the rise, looking out over rows of green. "Rest a spell?" Jack asked, because that seemed like the polite thing to offer. "Rest well," Big Tomas said, "but let your dreams keep working while you do." He nodded down at the field. "One person tends 1 row. Doesn't look like much, 1 row. But add up every row, every hand, and by autumn you've got a whole hill of gold." He glanced sideways at Jack's telltale, sugar-dusted pockets. "Same as sharing a jar of jam, I'd guess. Doesn't look like much either. 1 jar." Jack thought about that the whole walk home, past the fields turning gold in the late light, past his own reflection in Mrs. Alvarez's newly shined mailbox, and decided that Big Tomas was probably the wisest person he knew who also happened to be extremely good at growing vegetables, which seemed, on reflection, like the best kind of wise person to be. He whispered it to himself that night, tucked into bed, sugar-sticky fingers finally still, 1 jar. 1 row. 1 hand. It adds up. Somewhere above the rooftops, though Jack couldn't have seen it, the 4 watchers held steady, and the second thread of spring's wonder, kindness, given without keeping score, wove itself quietly into place. Chapter 6, The Night Knowledge Knocked. Chapter 6, The Night Knowledge Knocked. Theo was 8, all elbows and questions, and had been informed by every teacher he'd ever had that he asked too many of the second thing. On a warm dusk in early June, with the streetlights just beginning to hum on, Theo felt the wind carry something that was either an invitation or a very convincing imitation of one. "Let's play, come explore." He followed it, the way curious children follow almost anything, through the foggy gates of Hollow Park, where fireflies had started their nightly flicker and the last dogwalker's laughter still hung in the air like something you could almost catch. What happened next wasn't exactly a game and wasn't exactly a lesson, though it had ingredients of both. Theo found himself tracing shapes in the darkening air, the sharp cut of a kite's flight overhead, the low satisfied purr of Whiskers the cat sunning on a warm bench even this late, the slow soft shape a cloud made as it dissolved into the coming night, and every shape seemed to unlock a question he hadn't known he was carrying. Why does a kite need wind to fly, but a bird doesn't? Why does Whiskers purr, and does it feel the same on the inside as it sounds on the outside? Why do clouds forget their shapes? The park's little branch library, tucked at the edge of Hollow Park with its lights left on late for exactly nights like this one, had its windows lit gold, and old Mrs. Okafor, the librarian, and, as it happened, a woman who had once trained as a botanist before deciding books needed her more, was still inside, shelving. She didn't send Theo home. She never did. On nights like this, she'd long ago decided that a child full of questions at dusk was a rarer and more urgent visitor than any overdue book returner. She opened books wide on the reading table and let him trace roots underground with his finger, showed him how a seed the size of a fingernail actually knew, in whatever way a seed can know things, which direction was up. The soil to grow, the sky to stay up, she told him. Science and wonder, same day, same seed. They sat on the benches out front afterward, under the oak trees, while old Grandpa Lee, who happened by most evenings on his way to nowhere in particular, settled beside them and told a story about the creek in his own childhood, when it had run twice as wide and, according to him, twice as cold. Theo's brain buzzed the whole time like a beehive, filling up with facts and what-ifs in about equal measure, and the moon climbed high enough to watch the whole thing with what Theo could have sworn was a smile. Learning, Mrs. Okafor told him, as she finally walked him to his own front gate, was never really about a grade, Theo. It's about every single why you're brave enough to ask out loud. He went to bed that night with a magnifying glass on his nightstand and a notebook already half full, and whispered to the ceiling, "Tomorrow's full of how and where. I'm ready to go find them." The dragonfly circling the street lamp outside his window heard him say it, and made her second note of the season, a neighborhood that still leaves its library lights on for children full of questions. Good. Very good. Chapter 7, The Night the Park Came Alive. Chapter 7, The Night the Park Came Alive. Every summer, without anyone officially deciding it should happen, Willow Hollow threw itself a party. It started, that year, with the saxophone old Devon from 3 streets over, who'd played in bands nobody in the Hollow had heard of and everybody pretended to have heard of, setting up a borrowed spotlight and a folding chair at the edge of Hollow Park and simply beginning to play, the way some people simply begin things, without waiting for permission or an audience. The audience arrived anyway. It always did. Squirrels peered down from their oak leaf thrones, more curious than alarmed. Kids clapped from the swing sets while their mothers, unable to help themselves, started dancing right there on the grass, sneakers and all. A hedgehog wriggled in the shadow of the hydrangeas, working up the nerve to get closer, and Whiskers the cat, never one to be left out of anything involving an audience, stretched with enormous ceremony and sauntered directly into the middle of the impromptu parade, tail high, thoroughly pleased with himself. Somebody's neighborhood band, 3 guitars, a borrowed drum kit, and Devon's saxophone, which everyone agreed was doing most of the actual work, struck up something with a rhythm you couldn't help but move to. Grandpa Lee twirled his granddaughter, who was light as a leaf on her feet and twice as delighted, and a dog in a bow tie someone had put on him for reasons nobody quite remembered bounded through the grass chasing fireflies with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. The moon rose high and silver, a spotlight of its own, and one by one the small rituals of a summer evening unfolded exactly the way they were supposed to. Bikes leaned against the fence, phones tucked away, old Mrs. Lee, no relation to Grandpa Lee, though the Hollow had long since stopped trying to sort out who belonged to which Lee family, swinging her grandson's hand in time to the music while laughter spun up into the dark like it was trying to join the stars itself. Lemonade got spilled and nobody minded. A stray kitten, not Clem, a different one the Hollow hadn't quite adopted yet, though several people were already quietly plotting to curled up asleep in an abandoned picnic basket, unbothered by the noise. Strangers who'd lived 2 blocks apart for years without exchanging more than a nod found themselves, somehow, sharing a silly dance step neither of them could later explain learning. When the last note finally faded and the crowd began, reluctantly, to drift home, somebody dimmed the park's lights, and for one held breath the whole Hollow seemed to exhale together, the way a room does after singing. Magic's born when we dance on earth, Grandpa Lee said to nobody in particular, though Clem, curled at his feet, heard it, and thought it was possibly the truest thing anyone had said all summer. Chapter 8, The Backyard Dance Party. Chapter 8, The Backyard Dance Party. Not every gathering in Willow Hollow needed a whole park. Some of the best ones happened in a single backyard, with nothing more than a stack of borrowed costumes and a record player somebody's grandfather refused to let go digital. Jack's own backyard hosted this one, on a night warm enough for bare feet. A giant spoon, painted silver by 3 kids with more enthusiasm than technique, left over from some long-forgotten school play, stood center stage, and around it gathered a parade that would have baffled any adult who hadn't grown up in the Hollow and made perfect sense to every single child who had. Kids in cow-print pajamas. A toddler somebody had zipped into a fuzzy sheep costume for reasons lost to history. A laughing lamb who was really just Betty's little cousin giggling too hard to stay in character. Somebody had dragged out the moose head decoration left over from 3 Halloweens ago and propped it against the fence, or had nodded along to the music with an expression of profound, taxidermied approval. Jack's grandfather cranked the record player and called out "Let's dance," in a voice that suggested he'd been waiting all week for someone to give him an excuse, and the whole yard erupted, a flashlight beam tracing the edge of the makeshift dance floor, a kid in a starry reindeer costume bounding past a kid dressed, with somewhat less commitment, as a bunny. Parents shook their keys like tambourines. A cousin in a feather boa did a shuffle so silly it looped back around to genuinely impressive. The silver spoon, eventually, tipped over and knocked, most likely, by the family dog, who seized his moment and ran off with it triumphantly, prompting the entire yard to collapse into the same joke at once. The dish ran off with the spoon. Marshmallows came out after that, sticky and perfect, passed hand to hand under a moon that seemed, that night, to be leaning in a little closer than usual to watch. Clem, who'd wandered over from Mary's garden 2 yards down, sat at the edge of the fence and watched the whole thing with Ozzy perched above her in the old maple. "Is this the same kind of magic as the wedding?" she asked him. Ozzy considered the moose head, the spoon, the boy in a bow tie, the sheer, unembarrassed silliness of it all, and gave one slow blink. "I think," he said, "this might be the most magic kind. The kind that doesn't need a reason at all." Chapter 9, Betty's Lost Shoe and the Kindness That Followed. Chapter 9, Betty's Lost Shoe and the Kindness That Followed. Betty Marsh was 6, fierce, and by her own account an excellent runner, which was how she came to lose her sneaker in the first place, sprinting barefoot fast through the dew-wet grass behind the community garden on a dare from her older brother. "What'll I do?" she sighed, staring at one bare, grass-stained foot, until a stick caught her eye. Long, smooth, just the right size to lean on. "Here's a new shoe," she announced to no one, and balanced her way across the yard on the stick like a tiny, triumphant pirate, until, there, peeking out from beneath the oak's roots, glinting with dew, the real shoe reappeared. "Found you." She hugged it like a lost friend, and raced the last stretch home barefoot on one side and properly shod on the other, laughing the whole way. Her mother handed her cocoa at the door and said the thing mothers in Willow Hollow seem to have collectively agreed to say to every small disaster: mishaps make memories neat. Betty, who did not entirely understand what that meant but liked the sound of it, decided to believe it anyway. What Betty didn't know, because she was 6, and it is not a 6-year-old's job to know everything, was that her lost shoe had briefly been found, before she found it herself, by a little girl a year younger, out gathering daisies for old Mrs. Green 2 doors down. That girl, quiet, careful, the kind of child who notices things, had picked the shoe up, turned it over twice, decided it belonged to someone and wasn't hers to keep, and set it gently back exactly where she'd found it, tucked safe against the oak roots where dew wouldn't ruin it further, before continuing on to Mrs. Green's porch with her daisies. Little girl, where have you been?" Mrs. Green asked, taking the flowers with the particular delight of someone who has learned, late in life, to notice being noticed. "Gathering daisies for you," the girl said simply. Mrs. Green's smile, when it came, was warm as morning sun, and she pressed a sunflower seedling into the girl's hands in return. No plan behind it, no ledger being kept, just one kindness answering another the way a nod answers a wave. The girl planted that seedling that same evening in her own small square of yard, patting the soil the exact way she'd once watched Mary do it, murmuring something private and hopeful to the dirt. Neither Betty nor the Daisy girl ever learned how closely their 2 small mishaps and small kindnesses had brushed past each other that afternoon. But somewhere above Willow Hollow, in whatever ledger Dragonflies on errands keep, both were recorded, side by side, as the same entry: kindness, passed along without needing credit. The autumn thread of the wonder, the harvest thread, had begun to weave itself, one daisy, one shoe, one seedling at a time. Chapter 10, Rainy Day Rhyme. Chapter 10, Rainy Day Rhyme. It rained hard the third week of that autumn, the kind of rain that turns a neighborhood indoors and irritable, and it was on the wettest of those days that Grandpa Lee, dozing on his couch, woke abruptly, tripped on a rumpled rug reaching for his tea, and went down hard enough to bruise his hip and thoroughly wound his pride. "Oh, Grandpa," the whole house hollered, and within the hour half the hollow seemed to know about it, the way news travels through small neighborhoods regardless of weather. What happened next was, in its own small way, the clearest proof yet of everything the Dragonfly had been quietly grading all season. The Alvarez family next door, the same family Jack had been quietly running jam and errands to since spring, showed up within the hour with a pot of soup that hadn't even fully finished cooling from their own dinner. A pack of kids, Betty and her brother and Theo among them, arrived not with sympathy exactly but with the particular useful bluntness of children, helping him up gently and instructing him, with enormous seriousness, to take it slow. "Grandpa, we mean it." By evening he was propped in his armchair with tea steaming beside him, laughing, actually laughing, at the whole ordeal. "The day's not so bad," he told the room, which by then had filled with an improbable number of neighbors who had each found some reason their errands led past his porch that day. "It's just life's little pain. Rain's the same way, you know." Outside, the rain hadn't let up, and the kids had abandoned the sick room entirely in favor of the flooded yard, where puddles had turned Betty's rain boots into something like small, delighted lakes, and the family dog chased every raindrop that dared to splash near him with muddy, single-minded devotion. "We're all a little soggy," Betty announced to the yard at large, "but oh, what a day." Grandpa Lee, watching from the window with his bruised hip propped on a cushion and his tea finally at the right temperature, thought that the rain, the whole soaked, muddy, soup-scented mess of it, had taught the hollow something worth learning, that love, more than any umbrella, was the thing that actually kept you dry where it counted. Chapter 11, Robin, Whiskers, and Squeaky's Autumn Games. Chapter 11, Robin, Whiskers, and Squeaky's Autumn Games. By the time the leaves on the grandfather oak had turned the color of Jack's beloved lemon drops, the animals of Willow Hollow had settled into the easy, needling friendships that autumn seems built for. Ruby Robin Redbreast, to everyone who didn't know her well enough for the shorter name, had taken to perching on the garden fence each morning, tilting her head at Mary with the particular bright-eyed hope of a bird who has learned that dirty gardening hands usually mean scattered seed is coming. Mary obliged her daily, and Ruby had grown bold enough, by October, to hop within arm's reach before finally darting off in a rust-colored blur, exactly the way she liked it, close enough for company, quick enough to keep her dignity. Whiskers the alley cat considered Ruby his personal rival in a game neither of them had ever formally agreed to play. It began, as these things do, with Whiskers tiptoeing along the fence rail with what he clearly believed was total stealth. Ruby, unimpressed, fluffed her feathers, chirped quick, "Take flight," to absolutely no one but herself, and was gone before Whiskers's paws had finished landing. "No fair," he yelled after her, and gave chase anyway, a blur of striped fur through the garden's back hedge, while Ruby laughed her bird laugh from a branch just out of reach and called down, "Catch me if you can." They played this exact game most afternoons that autumn, through shadow and wind and the long gold light of 5 o'clock, until, eventually, the sun dipped low enough that even Whiskers admitted defeat, flopping dramatically in the grass while Ruby settled nearby, not too far, the way you settle near a friend rather than an enemy. They shared a worm. Ruby kept the larger half, which Whiskers allowed with the air of someone doing a great and generous favor, and curled up, eventually, in companionable silence beneath the hydrangeas. Squeaky, meanwhile, had discovered the singular joy of the neighborhood's fire hydrants, park benches, and teeter-totters as an obstacle course of his own invention, and spent most of October popping, quite literally, with an acorn scattering pop, from bench to hydrant to hedge, sneezing occasionally in a spray of fur that sent every child watching into helpless giggles. He helped a lost pup find its way home one gray afternoon, walking backward the whole way to keep an eye on him, and afterward napped in a patch of sun with the smug satisfaction of a squirrel who has, once again, made the whole neighborhood a little bit better simply by being thoroughly, cheerfully himself. Watching all three of them, bird and cat and squirrel, chasing and helping and playing in roughly equal measure, Clem found herself thinking about what Ozzy had said at the backyard dance party. The kind of magic that doesn't need a reason at all. She thought, more and more, that this was the Hollow's actual secret. Not one big miracle. Just an enormous number of small ones, happening constantly, mostly unnoticed, to anyone paying close enough attention. Chapter 12, 5 Little Swingers and the Shape of Joy. Chapter 12, 5 Little Swingers and the Shape of Joy. There is a particular sound that Hollow Park's old swing set makes in the last hour before dinner on a good day: chains creaking, kids shrieking with the specific joy of trying to swing high enough to see over the fence, and on one perfect gold-lit evening near the end of that same autumn, 5 children took over all 5 swings at once and turned the whole set into a small, chaotic kingdom. The first, a boy everyone called Rocket, though his mother swore that wasn't his real name, leapt off mid-arc with a shout of "I'm a rocket tonight," and landed with a triumphant plop in the grass, immediately scrambling up to declare himself ready to launch again. 4 little swingers took his place, pumping hard, racing each other for height, until one chain wobbled, click, and its rider came down laughing rather than crying, already scrambling to his feet with it my turn to lead. 3 swingers pushed on after that, ducking a low branch that brushed their heads, shouting about reaching the sky's horizon, until one hopped down to make room. 2 swung side by side in matching rhythm, declaring themselves kings of the whole park, until one leaped free to chase a stray kite string drifting past. And the last, Betty, as it happened, barefoot again by choice this time, not accident, swung alone but entirely unbothered by it, kicking higher and wilder with every pump, soaring like something closer to a plane than a girl, until she leapt down with a cheer and landed in the pile of her friends already sprawled in the grass, asking, "Who's next?" 0 swingers remained on the empty set by the time the streetlights blinked on, but the park itself stayed loud and alive with tag and races and one determined attempt to climb the slide the wrong way, 5 kids, and their joy scattering out across the grass like something too big to hold in one swing set anymore. Watching from the fence, Theo, notebook, as ever, tucked under one arm, found himself thinking about something Mrs. Okafor had told him weeks earlier, about how joy, like curiosity, wasn't really a thing you found. It was a thing you let out. A hop, a skip, a shout of yippee. Clap your hands where the dandelions grow. Stomp your feet where the porch swing tolls. No rules, no plans, just the joy of now, in your hands, same as the joy of a good question, same as the joy of a jar of jam handed through a screen door for no reason at all. He wrote exactly that down in his notebook, word for word, and underlined it twice. Chapter 13, The Happy Adventure of Friends and Song. Chapter 13, The Happy Adventure of Friends and Song. As autumn tipped toward its last gold week, the older kids of the Hollow, Theo and Betty and Jack and a dozen others, ranging from 7 to 12, began an evening ritual that started as one bike ride and slowly, without anyone quite deciding it, became a nightly expedition. They set off after dinner most evenings, arms linked or bikes wheeling in loose formation, past sidewalks and the edge of the park, up the low rise where the streetlights hummed and the whole sky opened out enough to actually see stars. Glow sticks came out. Somebody's paper lantern swayed from a bike handlebar, trailing light along the road like a small comet of its own. They shared a single playlist off someone's cracked phone speaker, sang along badly and happily, spread a bear-printed picnic blanket across the grass at the top of the rise, and simply existed there together under a moon that seemed, most nights that autumn, to be paying particular attention. It became, without anyone naming it as such, a kind of quest, though not one with a treasure at the end, unless you counted the treasure of the evening itself. They planned forts they'd never quite get around to building. They planted wishes on dandelion seed heads and blew them into the dark. They flew a single battered kite that never once made it more than 10 feet off the ground and never once stopped being worth trying. What's our actual quest, though? Betty asked one night, lying flat on the blanket, staring straight up. Theo, notebook as ever nearby, thought about it seriously. To share a meal. Help a neighbor. Tend a path. I don't know. Just be here. Together. That's not much of a quest, Jack said, though he didn't sound like he minded. Harmony's not really that complicated, though, Theo said. It's mostly small stuff. A hello. A hand to hold. A story somebody remembers to tell. Nobody argued with that. They hummed themselves toward home eventually, a loose, tired, happy line of bikes and lanternlight, and it did not occur to a single one of them, though it would have occurred, instantly, to a dragonfly on an errand, had she been watching, which she was, that they had just, without any ceremony at all, completed the last and hardest of Willow Hollow's 4 wonders. Not a seed. Not a kindness given quietly. Not even a whole neighborhood dancing under one moon. Just this, a handful of children who understood, all the way down, that the best adventures were never far away. They were, simply, each other. Chapter 14, Bedtime's Backyard Sparkle. Chapter 14, Bedtime's Backyard Sparkle. Word came down Prosperous Hill the way word always did in Willow Hollow, not through any single announcement, but through a dozen small conversations that all somehow arrived at the same fact within the same afternoon. The comet everyone had been quietly watching the sky for all year, the one Mrs. Okafor had first mentioned to Theo back in June, tucked into a book about seeds and stars in the same breath, would be visible that very night, low and bright, just after the 4 watchers rose. Grandpa Lee, once he'd caught his breath from the news, was the one who suggested, and then, within an hour, the entire hollow had somehow organized that everybody simply gather in Jack's backyard, where the giant silver spoon still stood propped against the fence from the last party nobody had bothered to put away. They came with flashlights instead of costumes this time. A kid in a giraffe costume, recycled, gleefully, from some earlier holiday, giggled up at the first stars. A friend wrapped in a parrot-patterned blanket squawked with delight. A walrus in a fuzzy hat and a toad on a scooter raced circles around the yard, chasing nothing but the plain fun of moving fast under a sky about to do something extraordinary. Somebody had stuck a single glow-in-the-dark star to the trunk of the maple, and for a while the whole yard debated, with total seriousness, what exactly it might be. "Look here," the giraffe kid called. "Sparkle, spangled friend," someone else shouted at it, and everyone drew their own imagined constellations in the foggy night air until an owl-eyed grandmother, Mrs. Lee, this time, the one unrelated to Grandpa Lee, announced, with the enormous authority of someone who has told exactly this joke every year of her life, "Let's start a joke circle. Begin." Knock-knock jokes ran the yard ragged with laughter for a solid 20 minutes before anyone remembered to look up. And then someone did look up, and the yard went quiet all at once, the particular quiet that only happens when an entire crowd notices the same beautiful thing in the same half-second. The comet hung low over the rooftops, a soft bright smear against the dark, and closer, steadier, exactly where they'd always been. The 4 watchers shone brighter than Clem, watching from the fence rail with Ozzy beside her, had ever seen them shine. And drifting just above the giant silver spoon, wings catching every bit of that light and throwing it back twice as bright, was a dragonfly. "Tizzy Muzzy," Nellie Bly whispered. She was there too, of course, at the very back of the crowd, having spent the whole autumn quietly hoping, without quite admitting it to anyone, that she'd see her small blue-green friend again. "You came back." The dragonfly did not answer in words, exactly. But she circled once around Nellie's upturned face, light and unhurried, the way you might circle back to say goodbye properly to someone you'd once left in too much of a hurry, and then rose up past the maple, up past the giant silver spoon, up toward the comet and the 4 watchers both, and every single person in that backyard, without any of them quite agreeing to it beforehand, found themselves reaching the exact same thought at the exact same moment. Bedtime's magic, Mrs. Lee said into the hush, was never up there. It's here. It's always been here. Chapter 15, Hush, Little Star. Chapter 15, Hush, Little Star. What happened next is the part of the story every child in Willow Hollow tells slightly differently, depending on who's asking and how late it is, but they all agree on the shape of it, if not the exact details. The comet's light, they say, seemed to pause, not stop, exactly, comets don't stop, but pause, the way a held breath pauses, directly above the backyard, above the silver spoon and the giraffe-costumed kid in Grandpa Lee's grateful, still tender hip in Mary's garden 2 yards over where the spring seed had, weeks earlier, finally pushed up a single, improbable, silver-white bloom nobody could quite identify. Above Nellie Bly, whose string had broken. Above Theo's notebook, full of a whole year's why and how. Above Betty's found shoe, and Jack's shared jam, and the quiet Daisy girl's sunflower seedling, and every small kindness the Hollow had planted, mostly without noticing it was planting anything at all. The old legend, the one Grandpa Lee's grandmother had told him, up on Prosperous Hill, all those years before, said that whoever completed the Hollow's 4 wonders in a single turning year would earn 1 true wish beneath a passing star. Nobody in that backyard had set out to earn anything. That, it turned out, was rather the point. Ozzy, perched above them all in the maple with Clem tucked at his side, was the one who finally said what everyone else seemed to be feeling but hadn't found words for. "Hush, little star," he murmured, not really to the comet, and not really to anyone in particular, and yet somehow to all of it at once. "Do not fret, do not cry. We'll tuck you in with a lullaby of our own, if you'll have it." And so, unplanned, unrehearsed, the whole backyard began to sing badly, at first, the way any crowd does when nobody's sure who's supposed to start, and then, gathering itself, something that actually sounded like a lullaby. Grandpa Lee's cracked, warm voice under it all. Mrs. Lee harmonizing without being asked. Theo humming the tune he didn't know the words to yet. Nellie Bly, eyes on the sky, on the small blue-green shape still circling somewhere above them. When it came time, at last, for the wishing, because a whole neighborhood does, eventually, remember to make its wish, nobody asked for anything grand. Nobody asked to keep the comet, or to catch it, or to hold it on a string the way Nellie once, gently, mistakenly, had tried to hold a dragonfly. They wished, all of them together, in the loose, overlapping, half-said way a crowd wishes for one thing at once, simply to keep this. The backyard. The porch lights. The garden. Each other. The 4 watchers, so the story goes, brightened one final time, bright enough that half the children swore, the next morning, that they'd actually seen 4 separate points of light bow, very slightly, the way a guest bows on the way out a door, grateful for having been so well hosted. And then the comet moved on, the way comets do, off toward whatever other neighborhood needed watching next. Chapter 16, Good Night, Little Starlight. Chapter 16, Good Night, Little Starlight. The Hollow settled slowly after that, the way any neighborhood settles after a night it will talk about for years. Flashlights clicked off one by one. The giant silver spoon got, at long last, properly put away. Grandpa Lee was walked home, protesting the whole way that his hip was perfectly fine now, thank you, and did not need this much fuss, while clearly enjoying every second of the fuss regardless. Clem fell asleep that night the way she fell asleep most nights that year, curled in the crook of Mary's arm, half listening to a story about the day just finished, the shapes on the wall thrown by a nightlight doing their soft, familiar work of turning an ordinary bedroom into a place brave mice and kind bears and one particular flying girl might visit before morning. "Everything's okay," Mary murmured, the way she always did, the promise as old and as true as any bedtime ever gets. That's what a goodnight kiss is for. It chases the day's noise away. Down the street, Theo fell asleep with his notebook still open on the nightstand, one line, underlined twice, the last thing he'd written before his eyes finally gave out. Tomorrow's full of how and where. I'm ready. Nellie Bly fell asleep with her window cracked open, just in case, though she never did see Tizzy Muzzy again, not because the dragonfly had gone far, but because some friends, once you've learned to love them properly, don't need a string to prove they're still nearby. Sometimes, Nellie was starting to understand, the truest way to keep something is to let it go and trust it'll circle back on its own. Above all of them, above Jack's yard and Mary's garden and the grandfather oak where Ozzy kept his slow, patient watch, above Betty's found shoe by the door and the Daisy girl's sunflower just beginning to bud, the 4 watchers held their steady place in the sky, exactly where they'd always been, exactly where Grandpa Lee's grandmother had first pointed them out on a hilltop that felt, some nights, like it might have been only yesterday. For guardians watch the beds tonight, the old saying went, the one nobody quite remembered learning and everybody somehow knew. Their light guides us through shadowed flight. For corners hold our dreams secure, and steady watch keeps our rest so sure. The world outside kept humming its ordinary, extraordinary hum, a fan's steady sigh, a page turning somewhere, the tick of a kitchen clock, the rustle of one last leaf letting go of the grandfather oak and drifting, unhurried, down. Tomorrow would bring its own small adventures. It always did, in Willow Hollow. A new question for Theo. A new row for Jack. A new game for Squeaky and Ruby and Whiskers. A new bloom, perhaps, in Mary's garden, or a new stray curled up somewhere waiting to be quietly, thoroughly adopted. But tonight, the whole hollow was simply, entirely asleep, safe under 4 small steady lights, and one story, finally, properly, tucked in. Good night, little starlight. Good night, Willow Hollow. Good night. Author's note: Dear reader, this novel grew out of a much smaller book, a collection of poems and lullabies about dragonflies, owls, kittens, and a neighborhood full of small wonders. As I sat with those poems, I began to notice that they were all, in some sense, already talking to each other: the owl and kitten's wagon ride, the dragonfly on Nellie Bly's string, the garden, the park at night, the swings, the songs. They felt like scattered chapters of one larger story that simply hadn't been stitched together yet. So I stitched them together. Willow Hollow, The Four Watchers, Mary's Seed, Theo's Notebook, and the whole cast of children and animals are my attempt to give that original book's spirit a place to live and a plot to walk through, while keeping every one of its original moments intact inside the larger story. I hope you find, somewhere in these pages, the same thing Nellie Bly eventually learned to give her dragonfly: room enough to fly, and the trust that the things we love best have a way of circling back. Lot acknowledgements to my family, who tolerated countless poetry breaks during hikes and bedtimes. Thank you for your patience and endless inspiration. To Mrs. Lot, whose wisdom turned my life into words that sing. To every illustrator, past and future, whose art might one day bring the fireflies, owls, and dragonflies of Willow Hollow further to life. And to every child who has ever asked, what if? You are the reason Willow Hollow exists at all.